We are a quarter of the way through the NFL regular season. Johnny Sports Network here to provide you with my Week 5 NFL predictions. And I'm going to be honest, I am really starting to lose confidence a little bit. 7-9 for the second consecutive week. And I have not had a bad start to the season like I have this season. I don't know what it is about this season that is very difficult to predict. Week 1 was great, but other than that, it has just been completely disastrous. But it is a new week. Bye weeks do begin this week. The Lions, Eagles, Titans, and Chargers all have a bye week this week. And I am just hoping I can get back on the plus side of things. Week 5 NFL predictions. Let's get right into it. Let's give it a go. As always, we begin with Thursday night football. And this week we have the Buccaneers and Falcons. The Falcons right now are a slight favorite. This is their third consecutive home game, so they have this luxury of not having to travel anywhere for a third consecutive week. While the Buccaneers, they did bounce back after an abysmal performance against the Broncos, a convincing win over the Eagles, despite the Eagles missing their top two receivers in that matchup. And I do expect this game to go all the way down to the wire, as that is what happened when these two teams went up against each other last season. I do think there is a little bit of turnover here for the Falcons, even though, as I've mentioned already, third consecutive home game, not having to travel anywhere for the last 3 weeks. An emotional victory over the Saints, where Younghoe Koo made a 58-yard field goal to give the Falcons the win. I think there is some turnover in this matchup. I am going to pick the Buccaneers to pull off the upset and win this game on the road. We have an international game this week. Jets and Vikings in London on Sunday morning. The Vikings look to move to 5-0 on the year, while the Jets, they look to bounce back from an abysmal performance offensively against the Broncos. The defense played pretty well in that game. It was ultimately a low scoring game, but the Jets could not produce enough offense to win that game. And now they take on an undefeated Vikings team where Brian Flores has really frustrated opposing quarterbacks. And Aaron Rodgers does not have a good history against great defenses. And I do think Brian Flores is going to frustrate Aaron Rodgers. And perhaps the Jets, they could be looking to trade for a wide receiver that has been open about wanting to be traded. Someone that Aaron Rodgers probably knows pretty well. But that's another topic for another moment, for another day. But either way, I feel like this Vikings team, I feel like they're not getting enough credit for being 4-0 when they need to be getting all the credit in the world, as they have frustrated the 49ers and the Texans, and they were dominant against the Packers, but then the Packers, they did start to rally late, but they did get the win at the end of the day. And I think they frustrate Aaron Rodgers this week. I'm liking the Vikings this week to move to 5-0. Panthers and Bears. Andy Dalton will once again be the quarterback for the Panthers as they go on the road to take on the Bears. And there has been talks about Bryce Young will start again for the Panthers at some point by the end of the regular season, but it's unknown when that will be. But the Panthers, they look 10 times better offensively with Andy Dalton quarterback than Bryce Young. And that is expected. I'm not counting out Bryce Young yet at all. I just think that Andy Dalton, with his experience in the NFL, I do think that long term it's going to be good for Bryce Young to learn under Andy Dalton. And I was very close to picking the Panthers to pull off the upset in this game. But I have just been impressed with the Bears throughout this season so far. Even though they do sit at 2-2, I do feel like the two losses that the Bears had, those were games they probably could have won if Caleb Williams, if he did have a little bit more experience. And Caleb Williams, he's done really well so far this season as he does continue to take those next steps. And he may have not had a very flashy stat line this past week, but he didn't turn the ball over. And he got the most important stat of all, the win. And DeAndre Swift, he did get going for the Bears. And I do think that continues. I have the Bears winning this game. However, I would not be surprised if the Panthers pulled off this upset. I could definitely see it happening, but I am going to go with the Bears as they seem to get more and more confident every week. Ravens and Bengals. The Ravens are on a 2-game winning streak after a dominant win over the Bills on Sunday Night Football. While the Bengals, they picked up what I felt like was a must-win for them. I did feel like their backs were against the wall last week against the Panthers, as they could not fall to 0-4, or else I feel like their season was over. And having that win for the Bengals last week, knowing that they did have the Ravens next up on their schedule, there have been teams in the past that started off the season 1-4 and 1-5 that still made the playoffs. So the Bengals, they can still rally and make the playoffs, but the Ravens, they have gotten better and better each and every single week. The Ravens are probably the best 2-2 team that I've seen in the NFL in quite a while, as there were both games where they could have and maybe even should have won. And I do think the Ravens, they do make it 3 in a row. Even though the Bengals did get the win, it was against the Panthers, and it may not be saying much right now about them, but despite the Bengals being 1-3, their season is not over yet. Bills and Texans. The Bills, they look to bounce back after losing their first game of the season to the Ravens on Sunday Night Football last week. And they take on a Texans team who was off of an emotional victory over the Jaguars. A touchdown late in the game to avoid the upset. And we have a great quarterback battle in this matchup. Josh Allen and CJ Stroud, two of the league's best. And I do think this game is going to be a back and forth game. I do think both quarterbacks are going to have close to 300 yards passing apiece, maybe even more than that. And we did get news today that Von Miller is being suspended for 4 games for violating the NFL's conduct policy. And I do think the Bills, despite the way they lost last week, losing in dominant fashion, and the critics would say, well, this is what we expected from the Bills this season. We knew they'd struggle. We knew that they lost a lot of key pieces and Josh Allen would be in trouble, and he wouldn't have much success this season. But I just think this was a bad night for the Bills, and I do think they bounce back, and they do get the win this week. And I do think it is a bounce back performance for the Bills. Up next, we have the Colts and Jaguars. The Jaguars 0-4 on the year, looking for their first win of the season, and they take on a Colts team who gave the Steelers their first loss of the season. Anthony Richardson left the game but then he did return to the game, but then left the game again shortly after. And Joe Flacco had to finish the game, but the Colts, they did get the win. And this may be a surprise to people, but it may not. I'm at least not surprised by it. But despite being 0-4, the Jaguars are favored in this game. And the reason why they are favored in this game is because the Colts, they have not won in Jacksonville in years. I don't know at the top of my head how many years it's been, but it has been a while. And no matter who starts at quarterback, whether it's Anthony Richardson or Joe Flacco, I do think the Jaguars, they do get their first win of the season. And I do think that this could be the start of the turning point of the Jaguars season, as they do have a couple of games in London coming up against the Bears and the Patriots after this game. And the Jaguars, they do like to play in London. And Doug Peterson, he knows that his back is against the wall right now, as he was asked about his job security after falling to 0-4. And despite being 0-4, the Jaguars, they've been close in a couple games. They probably should have won against the Dolphins in week 1, and they were close last week against the Texans, but they fell just short. But I do think this week is the week the Jaguars get their first win of the season, as the Colts' struggles in Jacksonville continue. Up next, we have the Dolphins and the Patriots in the game where if you're going to pick all the NFL games, you have to pick somebody to win this game, as this will without a doubt be the lowest scoring game of the week. I'll be surprised if there's any other game this week that has less points than this game does, as I don't see either of these teams scoring more than 13 points. That is the expectations I have for this game, as the Dolphins without Tua, whether or not you think that Tua deserved the contract that he got, watching the Dolphins these past 2 weeks, it's at least justifiable that he did get a contract, because this Dolphins offense, they just look so lost without Tua. While the Patriots, they've had some moments where they have shown they can perform really well defensively. But in a low-scoring game, in what's going to probably be your lowest-scoring game of the week, in fact, it should be, I'm going with the Patriots in a game where I have to pick somebody to win. Browns and Commanders, two teams that are trending in opposite directions. The Commanders have won 3 in a row. Jaden Daniels has played well all season. He's done phenomenal in the past 2 weeks. While the Browns, they are 1-3 on the year. Deshaun Watson has been playing well all season long. The Browns, when they traded for Deshaun Watson, they had hopes that he would be able to return to the quarterback that he was when he was in Houston, but that has not been the case. And the Browns, when you consider the fact they did make the playoffs last season, this is pretty disappointing for the Browns. And in the one game they won, Deshaun Watson didn't exactly play phenomenal. He only played good enough to have the Browns win that game. And I am going to pick the more confident team, and that is the Commanders. And I do think the Commanders, they do make it 4 in a row. And Jaden Daniels, he continues his case for Rookie of the Year. Raiders and Broncos, and there is some drama within the Raiders right now. Antonio Pierce was caught in 4K liking a post on Instagram referencing that Davante Adams was not going to be on the Raiders for much longer. And then earlier today, Davante Adams was being interviewed, and he said that Antonio Pierce has not reached out to Davante Adams. And Davante Adams talked about how there's no communication with anybody from the team. And within the last half hour of me recording, Davante Adams has informed the Raiders that he would like to be traded. He's requesting a trade. And a few moments ago, there was news reported that the Raiders, they have heard from some teams, and they would like to send a second round pick and some additional compensation for Davante Adams. And it's very interesting to think about which teams are reaching out to the Raiders. But it is another topic for another moment. But on to this game here. Both teams, they are off of victories from last week. And this feels like a game where I think it goes either way. Both teams, they just feel pretty unpredictable to me. The Broncos defense, I feel like, is slightly better. But I am going to go with the Raiders. I think it's one of those games that's decided at the very end. I am going to pick the Raiders to pull off this upset, as I haven't really predicted any upsets so far. There has to be a few every week, right? I'm going to go with the Raiders, despite the drama and what's happening right now. Cardinals and 49ers. The Cardinals, they have not looked good offensively in the last 2 weeks. And defensively, they didn't look well against the Commanders either. But Jaden Daniels has been on a whole nother level in these last couple of weeks. And now they go on the road to take on a 49ers team that they are starting to get some players back. Deebo Samuel came back. George Kittle came back. And we have more news on Christian McCaffrey's injury. He did go to Germany, and it turns out the Achilles tendonitis that he is suffering from in his right leg is now also in his left leg as well. And there is still no true timetable when Christian McCaffrey will return, if he will be able to return this season. But Jordan Mason, he has done well so far this season. And I do think the 49ers, they do get the win here. The Cardinals, in these past 2 weeks, they have been pretty disappointing. Especially last week against the Commanders. I really felt like the Cardinals were going to be a lot better offensively than what they were. And I'm going to pick the 49ers to win, because even though the 49ers, they do sit at 2-2 on the year so far, we've seen this before with the 49ers. They may not start off very well, but then as they get healthier, as players start to return, they do start to get better. And I think that is the case this season, once again for the 49ers. I think they win very convincingly. Packers and Rams. Jordan Love returned for the Packers last week against the Vikings. Although I did feel like it would have been smarter for the Packers to sit him out for one more game and have him return this week against the Rams, given how dominant the Vikings defense has been throughout the season so far. And the Vikings may have only won by a score of 31-29, but 22 of those 29 Packers points were in the fourth quarter. And the Vikings, they were not as aggressive in the fourth quarter as they were throughout the entire season so far. And Jordan Love, he did throw 3 interceptions in that game. And for the Rams to win this game, with them being decimated with injuries, Kyren Williams is going to have a big performance for the Rams. As Aaron Jones, he may have had 93 rushing yards against the Packers last week, but he carried the ball 22 times, only averaging 4.2 yards per carry. I do think the Packers, they do contain the run of Kyren Williams good enough to win this game. And I do think Jordan Love, I think he will play cleaner football this week. And the Packers, they do bounce back after the loss last week in a game that was closer than what it really was. Giants and Seahawks. I will admit the Giants, they have been doing better than I thought they would be at this point in the season so far. Ever since week 1, they have been fairly decent. They took the Commanders down to the wire in week 2. They upset the Browns in week 3, which many people are not saying it's an upset because the Browns are the Browns, but we can't take away the fact the Browns were about 6-point favorites in that game. And this past week against the Cowboys on Thursday Night Football, the Giants, they did hold their own in that game, but the offense just couldn't produce enough to win that game. And now they go on the road to take on the Seahawks, looking to bounce back from their first loss of the year to the Lions on Monday Night Football. Kenneth Walker, he did return to the lineup as he did miss the last couple of games. And Kenneth Walker, he looked pretty great. And I do think the Seahawks, they do bounce back and they do get the win. However, I am curious to see the Giants having a rest factor in this matchup compared to the Seahawks, as I do tend to have more of a favoritism towards picking the teams that played on Thursday the week prior, as they are going to have about 10 days of rest compared to the Seahawks having 6 by playing on Monday. But I still am going to pick the Seahawks. However, this somewhat feels like the Giants are going to keep this close and it's only a field goal game. That's what I'm getting out of this game. But we'll see what happens. But either way, I am picking the Seahawks to win outright. Cowboys and Steelers, Sunday Night Football. The Cowboys picked up the win over the Giants last week on Thursday Night Football. And the Steelers, their first loss of the year against the Colts last week. But Justin Fields, he has been doing well throughout the first 4 weeks of the year, which I am happy to see, as I am personally rooting for Justin Fields because I do see the criticism that he has on social media, and I do think that Justin Fields and Dak Prescott, I do think they are 2 of the most criticized quarterbacks in the league, at least on social media. And the Cowboys, they may have played on Thursday Night Football last week, and I do tend to favor the teams who played on Thursday last week, as I do bring up every single week, because I do like the rest advantage the Thursday night team has in their next game. However, I just don't think that is the case for the Cowboys. Last week, I felt like the Cowboys would win by at least 2 touchdowns. I felt like it was going to be a get-right game for the Cowboys, but it wasn't the case. The offense, they did just enough to win the game. And now they go on the road to take on a Steelers team, one of the better defenses in the league, at least a defense that is pretty unpredictable. One week they can be one of the best defenses in the league, and another week they can look like a bottom tier defense. And depending on which Steelers defense ends up showing up, determines which team wins. Is it going to be the Steelers, or is it going to be the team the Steelers are going up against? And I'm going to go with the Steelers to win this game, because the Cowboys, they have not performed well offensively as of late. Even though they did have a rally against the Ravens, it was just too little too late. And I do think the Steelers do win in what I feel like will be a low-scoring game, which that ultimately has to be the case for the Steelers to win a lot of these games. I do think the right Steelers defense shows up. Week 5 concludes with Monday Night Football, Saints and Chiefs. The Saints, a heartbreaking loss to the Falcons last week, while the Chiefs, they did enough to win the game against the Chargers to move to 4-0 on the season. And I feel bad because I originally had the Chargers covering the 7.5 points until I remembered the injuries the Chargers were dealing with. I didn't remember right away the injuries the Chargers had, and I originally had them covering that spread against the Chiefs. But then I redid the segment where I did Chiefs and Chargers, where I said I felt like the Chargers' injuries is going to be a detriment in this game. But the Chiefs, once again for the second week in a row, that they do just enough to get the win at the end of the day. And Rashee Rice, it was originally feared that he was going to be out for the season, but it turns out that it's not a season-ending injury, but the return for Rashee Rice is unknown at this point. And I do think with this information, with Travis Kelce underperforming the entire season up until last week, he did really decent. This feels like a game where the Chiefs, once again, they do just enough to win the game. It's not going to look like a dominant and convincing victory. It feels like it's going to be one of those games where they just have to do enough to win and move on to the next week. And I do think that is the case. I think the Chiefs win, but I do think Derek Carr and the Saints, I do think they do enough to at least cover the 5.5 that the spread is right now. Chiefs win, but I do think the Saints cover. And that will do it for my Week 5 NFL predictions. Comment your picks down below. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. And feel free to tune in to all my other videos. I am not sure what all I'm going to do on YouTube Shorts throughout the week, but please be on the lookout for anything I post on YouTube Shorts. And until next time, enjoy the games this week. I hope to see you back here once again next week. Let's hope that I can at least get back on the plus side of correct picks this week. Fingers crossed.